go.
Good evening. Welcome to our first ever Leading the Conversation on Race and Faith. And tonight we have with us our Mayor of Moorhead, Johnathan Judd. Welcome, Mayor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Pastor Mary.
And I would like to give a shout out and thank the churches that are helping to put this together. This event is being co-hosted by Good Shepherd and the First Congregational UCC Church in Moorhead. But we also have a number of other churches that are sponsoring this event, including Bethesda Lutheran, Christ the King Lutheran, Concordia College Campus Ministry, Crossroads Campus Ministry at MSUM, First Presbyterian Church, Grace United Methodist Church, Our Savior's Lutheran Church, Relevant Life Church, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, St. John the Divine Episcopal Church, St. Odelia Independent Catholic Church, and Trinity Lutheran Church. And if you are watching this from anywhere in Moorhead or anywhere else, we invite you to like this event and share it. We'd love to be able to broaden this conversation as much as we can. Our original hope when we started putting this event together was that we wanted to hear from the mayor his hopes for our community and also how we can, as churches, address inequality and racism. And we want to learn how to be the kind of neighbors that Jesus has called us to be. And so I'd like to begin our time with a word of prayer. Dear God, I thank you for this opportunity for us to have hard but very important conversation together. I pray that this conversation would lead us down the path that you have for us so that our whole community can experience health and wholeness. I pray that you would bless Mayor Judd. I pray that you would bless our time together, and we give you thanks for opportunities to be our real, authentic selves and talk about things that matter to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Pastor Mary. Excuse me, I'm really blessed to be here this evening. And, you know, it never gets any easier to speak at these types of gatherings because all eyes on you, and you have to watch, kind of make sure that the words that you say are going to affect folks in the positive way. You know, I'm really blessed to be here and to represent the city in the capacity as mayor. You know, my story, many of you who know me personally, you know, has been a good story, but also it hasn't came without its own set of challenges. But, you know, the thing that I love about being mayor of Moorhead and being an active resident within our region is that we are a strong, resilient community. And I think that is representative of not only the individuals, but within our neighborhoods and our institutions that are present within our city. I will just say, moving forward as we have this conversation tonight, is that my words are my words. My stories are my stories. And what I mean by that is my experiences may be different than what other folks in our communities have experienced. So I want to make sure and be clear that when I speak, I do not speak for all folks of color. Everyone's got their own individual experiences in life, and so I don't want my personal story or my opinions to minimize other individuals that may have experiences that are vastly different from my own. Also, I want to be sure that in asking the questions, or sorry, answering the questions, that I will practice humility, because again, I'm not necessarily the local resident expert when it comes to race relations. And again, this is a journey. All of this is a process. We all sit differently as far as what our life experiences are our education. And so I want to be sure that when I say the words, if there's anything that needs to be clear or things that need to be that may need more clarity, feel free either to email, or I think we're on social media, post a question to Pastor Mary, or after this event, feel free to email me at my city email, and I will be gladly able to answer any questions that might need some more clarity.
And I want to make sure that people know that as we're having this conversation tonight, that you can type in your questions on Facebook, and we have some questions that are prepared ahead of time, but we also want to make sure to include those questions that come live during this event. The first question that I want to ask you is a video question submitted by Becky Lynn, and she's one of the pastors at Relevant Life Church. And so let's hear her question on video.
Could you talk a little bit about your own experience with racism? And then along with that, what would you say to somebody who maybe expresses the opinion that racism doesn't happen in Fargo-Moorhead, or that they believe that racism is a very isolated event in our community?
Okay. Well, Pastor Becky, I will probably share two examples of how I have been involved with or how racism has affected me. I will say the one I'll pick out is an educational model. And I think the example I will use is that when I grew up in North Carolina, I'm a first-generation college student. And my grandparents, I think my grandfather had an 8th grade education and my grandmother had a 6th grade education. And I remember living with them in my younger years, going in, and I think At the time, you had to take these, I think they were like an Iowa basic skills test. There was some sort of assessment tool that is used in order to gauge where you fit in the elementary school and the types of classes you will take. I remember being with them and then my grandfather asking the question about how I scored, and apparently I must have scored well, from what I could gather from the conversation. But the teacher or the counselor in the school was somehow trying to convince my grandparents that, yeah, I might have scored well, but it wasn't good enough for me to be placed in a classroom that would challenge me. And I guess my grandfather, maybe not having the most education himself, at least had enough common sense to understand that something just didn't add up. And so in talking with our pastor at our church, there were other families that were in the church that also had that same experience with this specific counselor. So that's when I knew at an early age that at least I was treated differently for some reason. The next example I will use is that when I was 17, I moved up to Fargo, and I was a student at Fargo North High School. And I lived with a family who is near and dear to me that took me in for a year. One night, we were up at the North Side establishment. I think it used to be this was a Kmart up in North Fargo. And we were going through, and I remember what we were purchasing, but it was just some minor goods or something like that before we were going home. And apparently, we went through the line, and someone there, I presume to be a manager of some sort, stopped me before I exited the store. But he didn't stop. I call him my brother, though we're not blood. But they allowed him and the two other people who we were with to go through the line and were walking out the door, but he stopped me. And then not only did he stop me, he made me take off my coat, take off my sweatshirt, because he thought that I had stuffed something in up under my sweater or coat. I obviously didn't have anything, but there was just maybe, I would consider he had a race issue, because the other individuals that were with me were not stopped, but I was. And those are the two that I'll point out. Obviously, there are other aspects or examples I can talk about, but those two in particular are that I mostly recall.
And when you went through those experiences, did you know that it was racism at that moment, or is it when you reflect back or after it happened and you're like, oh wait, they stopped me because I'm black, not because I actually did anything wrong?
The younger time, I knew I was being treated differently. I didn't understand, because you don't necessarily, at that time when you're young, they say racism is taught. And at that particular time, I knew I was being treated differently. My grandparents, hearing them talk, you began to kind of understand why. So that's when I started figuring out that it was a race-related looking back when I'm in high school, because that wasn't the first and only time that happened in the educational system. But the Fargo incident, absolutely. Oh yeah, I knew. And that was pretty blatant, because again, the other folks that were with me were white. And so, but I was the only one that got stopped.
Yeah, and then Pastor Becky's other question in the video had to do with, how would you talk to someone who doesn't think racism exists in Fargo-Moorhead, or doesn't think it's a problem, or maybe just thinks it's only very isolated?
That is a very good yet tough question to answer, because the issue is that unlike other aspects in our American history, the Upper Midwest has not had to deal with issues regarding racism in our history. Not saying that there hasn't been, but there hasn't been to the magnitude of the civil rights that took place in the southern U.S. and then most northern cities. So to them, racism doesn't look like racism. It probably looks a lot like prejudice or bias, which is more of an individualized concept. I think when we talk about racism, and I think it's important to know the constructs of institutional racism, where the institutions that are built, they're built on a foundation that are meant to exclude people of color from those institutions. So I think when you're having a conversation with individuals and you're talking about the race construct, I think it's harder for people to understand because the term racism more than encompasses just a person saying something that's a joke that's not appropriate. I think it's hard for them to understand that racism is more about the institution itself and the foundation in which that institution is racially biased or based. So it's a much longer conversation you have to have than just talking about racism as being just something that's an individual bias or a prejudice, and it's more about the system itself. So it's a really hard question to answer.
Well, and it's more maybe the air we breathe. Like, we don't always question the actual structure that we're living in. That's just maybe from whatever context you come from, you're just, oh, this is the way it is, and it's part of the air you breathe, and you don't realize that it has been built on making some people feel included and other people being excluded.
Correct. And that right there alone is probably at a minimum a half an hour conversation to have, because if you're new to really wanting to have the conversation, you have to talk to people that don't look like you to really get a basis for what racism looks like. And it's hard if you don't surround yourselves around folks who've experienced it. So I think it's only natural for individuals to minimize it because, again, it's an area you don't realize that the institution that maybe you're working in or that you're living in may be inherently racist. And again, it's one of those situations where when we hear the term, I think there's a danger in it being overused because it just minimizes the experiences. But again, if you don't ask the question to have the conversations with people that may be experiencing it, you're never really going to understand.
Yeah. Well, and I want to invite people who are watching tonight, if parts of this conversation make you feel uncomfortable, I invite you to sit with that. I invite you to not just keep scrolling and leave, but I invite you to sit with that feeling of discomfort. If you're realizing things about yourself or if you're starting to see things in a new way, that if you could hold on with us and stay with us for this night. I have another question from your pastor, Michelle Weber, at the First Congregational UCC Church, and she submitted a video.
Mayor Judd, you're in a unique position in our city because you get to see a lot of different things and the way our local systems work. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, where are the racial divides in Moorhead and what needs to happen to correct them?
All right.
Good question, Pastor Michelle. You know, I walk, and I post on social media that I walk. I've walked this whole city probably more than a couple times now. But there's a reason why I do that. It is obviously to stay healthy and lose some weight, because I'm down 110 pounds thanks to those walks. But I also want to take a visual of each neighborhood that we're blessed to have in our city, because each neighborhood has a story. And I do think deeply in that regard because there's a history in these neighborhoods. But also the story tells what you see and what you don't see. And so to answer the question regarding racial divides, it's no one's fault by any means. But if you look at many major cities in the U.S., and we are not excluded from that, we do have communities that inherently, and again, unintentionally, are divided. There are some communities that have more diversity than others. And it's not a racial divide to be a negative. And again, I don't want to take away, and we're not talking about socioeconomics this evening. That's a whole different conversation. But if you look at our communities, take a walk through our city, you will see and you'll want to question, which you should from an equity perspective, why do we have more diversity in certain neighborhoods and not in others? That should be an open-ended question to kind of figure out, okay, there are divides here. I would also say in our school district, Superintendent Lunick and I have talked about this. I used to work as a family advocate at Horizon Middle School before I took the bar exam. And you walk through the school and you look through the lunchroom, and there is a book that talks about why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria. Well, we have racial divides within our own schools too. It's very visible. And I think when you look at the racial divides, I think you look at communities or neighborhoods. I think you're looking at within our schools. I think if you look at even the sports that we participate in, I think there's a division there. And don't look at division as being that there's a tension. We're not talking about divides meaning a tension amongst races. We're looking at divide meaning some folks are visible in these dynamics, some folks are not. Mm-hmm. And that within itself is a divide. Mm-hmm. No one's to blame for that. This is not a conversation about pointing fingers or blaming, and I want to make that clear. But you have to question, why don't we see other cultures, other folks in these spaces?
I received a few questions from someone on Facebook is wondering, her name is Amber Herbrinson. She says, here's my question. Where do we go from here? I feel like the teenagers have a better plan of action and what they want our community to look like than the adults, and it's very frustrating. So I thought I'd ask this one as a follow-up, because you mentioned being in the middle school and you already see people dividing up, but there also is that energy and passion from a lot of teenagers who are wanting to see change, and they're not seeing that leadership from adults.
Again, a really good statement. Here's the deal, and I'm a person that likes to think holistically about a lot of things, and I'm a processor. I have to be, as mayor, any decisions that the council makes or that the commission makes, we have to sit back and process, because this doesn't just affect a ward, this affects the entire city, and that permeates throughout even our region. So what I would say is the teenagers, the young adults, they have the passion and the energy, and I understand and respect their frustration. I think it's probably warranted because society hasn't moved the needle, if you will, as it should have in social justice, and we're falling behind in education, and the socioeconomic divide is. There is that construct of race. I would challenge the leaders to continue having the conversation, but I would also talk about tangible action steps that we need to do. Conversations like these are great, and it's funny that the question came up now, because there was an article that I think someone had submitted a question for, and I guess I might as well read it now, but I want to quote it. It's from Trey Johnson. I'm not sure who submitted the question regarding Trey Johnson.
I think Pastor Michelle did, but do we have that video? We could actually have that video with Michelle Weber, and otherwise, I think it's her third video she submitted. And then we can get the quote and the question.
Freelance writer Trey Johnson recently wrote that when racial violence erupts, he knows exactly what his educated liberal white friends are going to do. And what they're going to do is form a reading group and read a book and listen to the voices of people of color. And I know that both of these are important things, but he says in his article that these aren't things that change the systems that create the racial violence. So I'm wondering, Mayor Judd, what it is that we should do after we listen and read.
Okay, so to Ms. Herberson's point, because I'm going to piggyback your statement, your question/statement, along with Pastor Michelle's. So the article is authored by an individual named Trey Johnson, and the article can be found in the Washington Post. I believe it's June 11th, 2020. And as we have this conversation for folks at home or watching abroad, again, we're going to have the conversation. So again, be willing to be uncomfortable because as you probably know, I'm uncomfortable sitting here. So we're all going to be uncomfortable together tonight and moving forward as we have this conversation to have our city move the needle. But the quote or the title of the article is, "When Black people are in pain, white people just join book clubs." And so there's when we talk about what can we do as leaders and as the younger generation, Mr. Johnson has this quote: "The right acknowledgement of Black justice, humanity, freedom, and happiness won't be found in your book clubs, protest signs, chalk talks, or organizational statements. It will be found in your earnest willingness to dismantle systems that stand in our way, be they at your job, in your social network, your neighborhood associations, your family, or your home." So for those of you that are at the beginning of this journey, the best way to have the conversation is simply in your home, with your family. That's a start. There's also readings and things that you can get to as well, but we all as allies can get that information. But what Mr. Johnson is trying to say, and I would say to the younger folks, if you're looking at moving the needle, if you're going to show up to protest, that's great. What you need to do is challenge your leadership in a strategic, and I want to emphasize strategic. If you're going to march, have an end game of the result that you want to achieve from us as your leaders to hold us accountable. Bottom line, you have to have a strategy, an action plan in place so we can move this needle together. To the leaders that are sitting where we're at, I would say it is incumbent upon us to be able to move the needle by doing what Mr. Johnson has talked about. If you're going to march, go back to your institution, whether it be your church, your place of work, look around, examine the environment, and wonder to yourself, all this talk about race and equality and equity and inclusion, I'm noticing that maybe perhaps none of my colleagues or one of my colleagues is of color. Go to your manager, or maybe you as a manager should be examining why is that the case. That's when you start moving the needle and examining that and having those uncomfortable conversations to get to the end result. That's being strategic.
Well, and I want to ask another question following up on that. Since this is an event sponsored by churches, church leaders are wanting to engage in a good way. And this is Becky Lynn's other question from Relevant Life. She said, "What are some specific things that churches can do to create safe places of worship for people of all races and backgrounds? And what are things that we as white church leaders may be doing intentionally or unintentionally to create barriers for people of color, to feel comfortable in our churches?
I would say that churches should always be a safe space to have dialogue. Keep in mind when we're talking about race, we're not talking about a political issue here. We're talking about a humanity issue. Equity and inclusion and diversity should never become a politically divisive topic. It's a human topic. It's a do the right thing topic. It's a moral topic. It's an ethical topic. Churches should be able to embrace having these uncomfortable conversations. I'm hoping this is not going to be the last time that we talk about this, because again, churches are safe spaces where they should be welcoming to people of all races to be able to come in and have the conversation that needs to be had. And it's going to be uncomfortable, because if you're doing the work, then it's going to get done the right way, but it has to be in the right environment. So for churches, I would say that it simply starts with an invitation. It just, hey, I see you walking, and I know we're not comfortable having those conversations because in our region, and I talk about this all the time, we're kind of passive aggressive, but we're going to have to work through that, folks, if we're going to move the needle. I think it has to be a mutually accountable relationship with the church to say, we're going to take the time to invite someone that maybe doesn't look like us, not for just the reason to have the conversation, but just because we want you here. Then, when you begin to create that relationship, and it will take a while, then you can start talking about the conversations that need to be had to move the needle. But an invitation speaks volumes. And as far as white pastors or the church leaders, I think you have to be able to really facilitate these uncomfortable conversations like you're doing tonight, Pastor Mary. You know, I think we have a lot of folks that haven't dealt with this topic before. I think it's important to be sensitive about where people are at in their journey. We listen with humility, but I think also it is incumbent not only about our white church leaders, but also as people of color. We can't judge people where they're at. We can't. People are going to make mistakes along the way. And in this region, I will tell you, the majority of the time is completely unintentional. And we have to be able, just like our church leaders, to allow people within these safe spaces, which we have invited people to have the conversation and let people make mistakes along the way so they can grow.
And maybe we as church leaders have to be okay with setting the example and being uncomfortable, putting ourselves in that place and not just telling our people to do it.
Absolutely. And allowing people to tell their stories, you know, and just be able to listen. Not everything needs an action item right after you hear the story. Sometimes you have to process it, go do your own research, and come back, and then you strategically take action.
Yeah. I've got another question here from Pastor Roger Graffenstein from Grace United Methodist, and he submitted his question on a video.
What do you see as our most pressing challenges? And are there some invisible challenges that aren't really invisible, but that most of us don't see day to day, but that hinder us in moving forward and being the healthiest, most accepting, embracing, inviting community we can be? I look forward to your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor, for the question. You know, we have a number of challenges, but I got to say, the basic foundational component is just communication. You know, it really is. We have to start talking. And I know it's a cliche and it's an overused term, but it's the reality in our region is that we just don't get out and know and meet our neighbors. I mean, that's, you know, in a community that we should all be blessed to live in, that generally is a safe community and great people with great energy, positive energy. It's just really fascinating that we don't get out and really try to talk to someone who we don't necessarily know.
Even before COVID.
Yes.
We weren't always doing a great job of it.
I mean, listen, folks, and I'll just be very candid. Most of you, I wouldn't be sitting here if most of you didn't vote for me. So can you imagine how uncomfortable it was for me to go knocking on doors of individuals that I didn't know, asking for your vote to be sitting here telling my story here tonight? So, I mean, my whole thing is that you entrusted me to sit here, and it was a very uncomfortable process for me, for one, to be asked to consider being the person to lead the city, but also the process. But I will tell you what, I grew as a person. I became, I think, a better person, a better father, a better husband, just a better leader, having gone through the struggle and the process of being uncomfortable. So communication, to answer your question, Pastor, is the biggest, I think, the biggest hurdle we have to get over. And what I mean by communication is not just people doing all the talking, but also being able to listen and not talking over each other that we talked about earlier, Pastor Mary. I mean, we can't talk over somebody. We need to be able to open up the doors to invite people to have the conversation. And as a person of color, I want to be able to listen and to what you have to say, but you have to also be able to listen to my journey as well. But once we get over the ability or the inability to communicate in our passive-aggressive part of the region, we can break down the other barriers and there are a number, but I think we have to be able to talk about the why. Why is it this way? And be able to listen to people's stories to get to that next step.
I've got a few questions related to, well, education and our educational systems. Our community is blessed to have wonderful institutions of higher learning, M-State, MSUM, Concordia College. And so I have a question from the Concordia College campus pastors, Dave and Kim Adams, and they submitted a video.
Hi, we are Kim and Dave Adams, campus pastors at Concordia College.
We're wondering how you think that Concordia College, as a college of the church, can be faithful in its action steps for anti-racism, both on campus and in the world at large.
Concrete steps.
Yeah, you know, again, great question. But again, I think I mentioned this the Sunday after the march in Fargo, is I don't have the answers for concrete steps, but we as a community need to figure out what those steps are and what they look like moving forward. But to answer your question as best as I can, pastors, I would say this. I would encourage, and it starts with, I think, us individually, to figure out what is your mission statement. What is your personal mission statement as it regards to equity, to race, to social justice? Take your personal mission statement, take it back to your institution. I used to work at Concordia. It's been a while. I looked up the mission before I came here tonight. And embarrassingly, I don't remember it all, but I know it's moving people forward through the Christian life, generally speaking, is the mission. Analyze the mission through an equity lens and through moving what you want to see in the world through the lens of social justice, but a part of that is going to have to be, what does it look like on your campus? But you have to include, as a part of that action in those concrete steps, students of color. And you have to listen to their experiences and how does that look in moving forth your own mission on campus. What you do on campus will permeate through the community. But again, it begins with an invitation. You have to invite people that don't look like you or may not be representative of what the student body looks like onto the campus, hear those experiences. You also have to listen to those experiences and then go into a strategic planning process, finding what the equity gaps are, finding what the race gaps are on your campus, and then you can move forward. So I apologize that I can't answer with the concrete steps, but again, there are people in the community that are resources that can help within the college how to get to those steps, but also how those steps can go on and move forth carrying out Concordia's mission off campus.
I've got another question submitted on Facebook about education, and this comes from Dakota Rhodes. How do we teach in our school the legacy of slavery and indigenous genocide in this country without whitewashing or just omitting it altogether?
Good question. We have to know and acknowledge our history. We're still a great country, and we're, I would say, the greatest country on earth. Even the greatest country on earth is going to have problems within its house, okay? We all, as institutions within our country and within our city, within our region, our state, it goes on and on, we're going to have things that are messy, and we're going to struggle through that. The educational system, we have to have knowledge and learn, and as a history major, this is sensitive to me because you have to learn from the history so you don't repeat it, but you also have to be able to learn from this history and teach it because we need to know it. I mean, it's just really that plain and simple. It obviously, knowledge of this history is going to have us develop a better understanding about how institutional racism not only affects people of color, it also affects white people too. It does. And I want you to ponder that. I want you to think about the fact that having this knowledge, as messy as it is in our nation's history, we're not necessarily saying you need to dwell on it, but you have to ask the question so we can grow. So I agree with Dakota that we have to just tell it. We have to tell it. We have to deal with it. We have to struggle with it. And we don't need to clean it up. I would say it needs to be age appropriate how you teach the history in elementary school and as you move up to high school and in college. But I think it's something we need to struggle with it just so you all understand we're not to blame for this. No one is to blame. But if we're going to move forward and be brothers and sisters in arms walking down this road for equitable communities later, we have to know it.
And we have to be responsible for the impacts that have come from those things that we inherited from the past. So at some point, we need to take responsibility as people who do have some sort of power, say, this is where we've come from. It's important to know about it so that we can start building things differently.
Part of why I got here is completely, sorry about that, is completely messy. I'm just going to tell you, my upbringing was not necessarily the most happy. Now, my mom would tell you differently. And I'm sure she's watching tonight, and she's probably telling me, you better not go there. But But I have to acknowledge, I mean, you know, we all have those things in our past that put us where we're at today. And by not acknowledging and embracing those things, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't be the leader that I am today. And that's why I'm saying I agree with Dakota that you can't just wipe that history away.
I've got a question now from Pastor Steve Peterson of Bethesda Lutheran, and it's also a similar question to your pastor, Michelle Weber, and so I've put them together. What positive signs do you see of greater diversity, more understanding, less racism in our community? In other words, what's going well?
Well, we're finally beginning to talk. That's good. You'll see some reoccurring themes here tonight. And talking is good. I think that is good. I think we're seeing, compared to where I was at when I moved to the Fargo-Moorhead area in 1990, the fact that we have more diversity here, and I think we've got more organizations in the community that are now being more visible in the work that they're doing. I'm seeing more businesses that are operated by folks of color. I see people that are diverse white folks that are supporting these businesses. I'm seeing more people in the community that are taking individuals of color under their wing and mentoring them to move forward in developing those businesses. I also see in our school district, I'm seeing more youth being active in a variety of ways, not just in athletics, but in the arts, in choir. I mean, there's a lot more activity that is taking place. So I see it from a social aspect, an economic aspect. I think, well, the fact that Moorhead has a leader of color, which I think speaks volumes of our city. Because you don't know how many times I go to the mayor meetings and there are folks that sit down and they go, really? How did this work? And my simple answer is, because our city just gets it. I mean, we do. It doesn't mean that we don't have our problems within our own city that we need to work on to take us to the next level. But the fact that I see people who are running for office that are of color, you know, and maybe seeing that what Moorhead has done in greater Minnesota has inspired other individuals and other communities to take a look at what we're doing right, that speaks volumes of our city. And I'm very proud, and that's why I'm proud to be here, because in greater Minnesota, Moorhead is the shining star, and I think that's what everything that's going right with what we have going on here.
Well, I have a lawyer question for you, because I was so excited. I've never talked to a lawyer about this Bible passage, so it combines Bible and law. I love it. So in the New Testament, in Luke, there's a lawyer who goes to Jesus, and he says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what does it say in the law?" And that lawyer says, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, well, you're on the right track, do that. But then the lawyer, being a lawyer, asks another good question, saying, but who's my neighbor? And so then Jesus shares that story of the Good Samaritan, and we have to use the word good because nobody thought Samaritans were good. So Jesus has the person who nobody thought was good be the one who helps the man who gets beat up by robbers. And Jesus says, so which of these three was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the lawyer said, well, it's the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. So how can we show mercy? Maybe not just, well, maybe answer it from a number of different ways. From the law standpoint, how do we show mercy in how we practice law? How laws get impacted or impact people and how they get implemented. I don't know, just where do you want to go with that? How do we show mercy?
You're getting deep. I like it, Pastor Mary.
Let's do it.
We're all in tonight. That's good. Mercy can be shown in a variety of ways. And so from the law part, for those of you, no matter where you're at on the spectrum, and I'm going to probably go a little bit slightly against Mr. Johnson here with his article. So I would say from the criminal justice standpoint, for those of you that may have an inkling in that, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is a good book to talk about racial disparities within our criminal justice system. It is a deep read, but it is a good read to kind of get you to understand the history. Again, going back to Dakota's point about the history. In order to address the racial disparities and how the criminal justice system is flawed, you have to understand and go back and know the history about how those laws were created and how, as they're being practiced, create this disparity. So when we talk about the mercy aspect of it, you have to be able to analyze when we're talking about criminal justice reform and showing mercy, you have to understand that by the mere formation of those laws, the reason why there's a racial disparity in the prison system is not because, the easy answer, because if we don't communicate, is because people of color commit the most crimes. That's when we have to have the conversation, for those of you that might think that way, to say, okay, well, tell me why you think that. And by reading the book and being able to process what's in that book, you'll understand that many of our neighbors are put behind bars because there are the laws and the ways that they are written and interpreted are, unfortunately, foundational components of institutional racism. So in practicing law, what we're asking for folks to do is to analyze the questions. We have a racial disparity in our criminal justice system in Minnesota. That disparity is manifested in the prison system. We have a disproportionate number of people in our prison system of color than we do that live in Minnesota. Why? I went over to talk to one of my classmates who works in a program over at our juvenile detention center here in Moorhead. We have a disproportionate number of juveniles of color in our juvenile detention center. In an area, in a region, and we are taking kids from all over the place that are white. Why? So in practicing law, and what I've done as a former public defender is to be able to analyze and visualize the lives of the clients I used to represent through how they got to where they're at. That is a way of showing mercy, is being able to tell those stories and having juries and having people sitting up on a bench to be able to analyze seeing things through the lens of some of these kids that I used to represent. So we show mercy by doing the work to educate ourselves, to get an understanding of why these disparities exist. Another short way that I think you can show mercy, and I think we have to, is to come and say, I don't know what to do now. I want to be a part of the solution, and I want to help, but I don't know what to do. Being vulnerable with yourself, no matter where you're at in the journey, and as a person of color, we have to allow that safe space, to allow the communication to take place, to express our vulnerability, to let the person who's willing to learn make those mistakes, but we will be there to build them up. That's showing mercy amongst your sisters and brothers. If you're trying to build community and you're trying to build a better neighborhood or just a relationship, whether it's at your work, in your church, showing mercy to me and how that manifests is being able to come with each other, being vulnerable, accepting people where they're at, and then being able to move forward to allow those mistakes to happen so you can be stronger.
Amen. I have a question. Just as a mom, I've got an 8-year-old son. How can I set an example through my words and my actions for my 8-year-old son so that he can grow up with awareness of the world around him? I've heard some parents say they want to teach their kids to be colorblind, but I don't think that's what we want to do. How do I teach my son to see color and embrace it and get out there and be willing to experience the world without fear of people who don't look like him?
Well, another thing for those that may be in that same boat, there's a book that we purchased, our kids. It's called Henry's Box. And it talks about slavery. It's the first book, I wouldn't say it's the first book, but maybe the first book that I think all 3 of our kids read, because it introduces an age-appropriate narrative about slavery. It doesn't go into the deep heart of institutional racism as it's historical within our country, but it gives a soft version to an 8-year-old or earlier to ask questions. You know, some of the questions I remember Tammy, my wife, and I getting were, well, why did Henry have to get put in the box? And then we talked about that. Having things like books, movies, documentaries, things that promote kids that may see other kids that don't look like them, that's a great place to start, the awareness piece. There are ways that you can introduce just through books, through music, and being able to have those conversations. I think we need to probably not get into the discussion about colorblind. And again, for those of you who use the term, I don't see color. This is not a comment to pass judgment, because it would be great if we lived in a society that was like that. Unfortunately, there's too many instances, especially recently, where that's not technically the case. I want you to see me. And if you don't recognize that I'm black, then you don't see me. And that's okay that you see me as black. Because again, when you talk to your children, you should embrace the fact that you have a mayor that's black, or you have a friend that's black. Engage in that conversation. As your child gets older, obviously the conversations will change, but then you just adapt what you're trying to teach your child to the nature of those conversations. But also, one of the best things you can do is just step outside your comfort zone. Invite more people that don't look like you, build relationships with those folks at your dinner table once we're able to sit down and break bread together, obviously. But invite somebody that you're beginning to nurture a relationship with to your dinner table. And that's what I think we should be doing as a community anyway. And hopefully we look forward to doing that in the future.
Well, I want to summarize some of the things we've talked about tonight. You've hammered home that idea of communication, of just be willing to talk to one another, be willing to also listen, and to be vulnerable, and the importance of knowing and understanding and acknowledging our history so that we can learn from it. You've also talked about how we can challenge leadership in strategic ways and find ways to make impacts in our own home and how we talk at home, how we are at work or at school or in our greater community. You've let us know this isn't a political issue. This is a human issue. And we as humans need to find a way to live together. And churches should always be a safe space. And that as churches, we should be willing to be vulnerable and make this space safe so that people can ask questions that they might not know how to word, but yet they should be allowed to ask those questions. And you've given us some good book recommendations, The New Jim Crow and Henry's Box. I think that's a fantastic place to start as well. But is there anything else you want to share? Anything that's on your heart that you just want to share with this community?
You know, I guess I want to thank everybody. There's been a lot of people who have reached out to me for support or to support me in the last few weeks. There are folks that I was completely unaware that I did not even expect to hear from that have reached out for support or to support me. And I'll tell you, when I started having this conversation, I didn't realize that it was going to be something that was going to actually take off. I spoke from my heart on that Sunday after the march, and I was just fascinated, and I'm completely humbled by the fact that people are engaging and willing to engage in this conversation. I really hope that we as a city really take a look at how we are doing, because we're great at what we're doing. I think we have a lot of leaders in the community in your own right, whether it's in our educational system, our faith communities, our leadership on city council, our business community, our law enforcement. We have a lot of people doing a lot of good work in this community. Please, I read things on social media from people who I love and respect. Please take time before you hit send. Please process what it is that you want to say and be willing to express your vulnerability. Many of you are well aware that we've got people in our community who work in a lot of areas. You can be pro Black Lives Matter and also be pro good, ethical law enforcement. Please don't let these two things divide our nation, first of all, overall, but on a local level, don't let it divide our community. It literally, as my grandmother would say, hurts my heart when I see good people who I know are waking up in the morning, waking up to do the right thing, and their emotions get the best of them, and let these things divide us as a city. Our children, our families, our leaders, whatever sector you're in, we all can and will do better. So moving forward, that's all that I ask is don't be afraid to have the conversation. To the extent I can get back to you, because there's a lot of you I need to get back to, I'll do my best to get back to you to have the conversation, but also feel free to reach out to other individuals to have the conversation too. Step outside of your comfort zone and just say, hey, JJ, you know what? I don't get it. Can you just have a few minutes over coffee, and I'll do my best to make time for you. But also feel free to reach out to people who are also doing the work to have that conversation. Don't divide us. I mean, we are truly Moorhead strong, and we truly are Moorhead proud. Let's make sure our words and our actions exemplify that.
I have one final question. What brings you joy?
My family.
Amen. Amen.
My wife, my kids, family.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us online tonight. Again, if you found this to be a meaningful discussion, I hope that you'll like it. I hope that you'll share it. I hope that it can spur on some constructive conversation, not only online, but also face-to-face with people in your own families. And I invite you to pray for Mayor Judd, pray for the other elected city officials, all those who are working hard throughout the city in a lot of different roles. This has been a trying time. I think that being hit with COVID has created all sorts of brand new challenges that all the leaders in our city have been dealing with and have been trying to soldier through in the best way and navigate what we're learning about COVID-19, what we're learning from our state leaders and national leaders. This has been a trying time, but in the midst of it, we have real opportunities. And so I invite you to pray for our leaders, because we also, why not deal with difficult things at this time? Things that are hard to talk about, things that maybe we try to cover up when it's convenient. But now during this time when we're already dealing with other challenges, I invite you to pray for our leaders so that we can have a good tone, a tone of goodwill, a tone of humility, of vulnerability. I invite you to really reread those messages before you hit send on social media or an email. Make sure that it is the best part of you that's coming forward and that you have prayed about your words before you send them. But I am just so thankful that you came here to talk honestly about your experiences, and I thank you for your leadership of our community. And I really have great hopes for Moorhead, and I know you do, and I pray that we can keep this going.
Thank you, Pastor Mary. Thank you for all your work, as well as the other leaders in the faith-based communities here in Moorhead. Thank you.
Have a good night. Thanks for joining us.